presentation is Professor Radzilowski, speaking to us about Ukraine, Russia, and America, current events, future prospects. I think of all the faculty here, Professor Radzilowski probably has more publications. I don't know. I haven't counted everybody. But certainly his work has been about Eastern Europe, and he has a short book on the Ukraine. And he also worked for USAID, right?
USAID, yeah.
USAID in the Ukraine.
Actually, for the University of Minnesota,
Okay.
They were USAID programs administered through the university, but in Ukraine. But I was not in Ukraine that much. I was not actually resident in Ukraine. I helped manage the Ukrainian programs.
Okay, so
In the State Department.
we'll have a perspective, a little of the past and the present. And I think you're going to find this spring's programs, and again we call it spring even though it starts in January. Dr. Polonska is going to talk about roots of terrorism in February. We're going to have a panel discussion in March for Women's History Month and focusing on Chechen during World War II. And then we have a program in April with Dr. Urquhart, Dr. Radzilowski, perhaps myself. We're looking to put that together on heraldry, crests, and kinship art. So I think we've got a pretty exciting program for the spring, and I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want a special thanks to the librarians, Kathleen, Kathy, and Jill, because they put a lot of effort into putting together these very informative programs, and I think all of us who've lived in Ketchikan for a while appreciate this kind of informative presentation. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Radzilowski.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone, and what we'll do is I'll talk a little bit, and I have sort of a few slides to show you, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers, and people have. I know if you have any comments as well, I'd be happy to entertain those. I'd like to start out though. This photograph is the Donetsk Sergei Prokofiev Airport. It's an international airport. This was completed in 2012. It was a major remodel for the European Soccer Championships that were held in Donetsk in 2012. That year, 2012, this airport had had 1 million people pass through. 1 million passengers pass through the airport. This is the airport in October a few months ago. Same airport. You can see what's left of the signs. This airport was the scene of major fighting between Ukrainian government troops and Russian-backed militias and also Russian army troops. About a week ago, the Ukrainian troops held this terminal building for 242 days. It was actually described as a mini Stalingrad. About this time last week, Russian-backed forces, spearheaded by what appears to be elements of the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade, which is based in Murmansk in northern Russia, that was brought in to spearhead the assault, finally broke the Ukrainian defenses. They did this by actually detonating part of the roof over where the Ukrainian defenders were. They collapsed the roof on top of them. One Ukrainian commander afterwards said, our men stood fast, but the concrete did not. Now, in the fighting that's been going on in eastern Ukraine, I believe that over 5,000 people have died thus far in the conflict. There's been shelling of civilian areas. There's been human rights abuses, various kinds. Some of the Ukrainian soldiers that were captured in this fighting were actually there's a videotape of them that's been circulating of them being physically attacked and abused by the pro-Russian militias that are holding them, that are now holding them as prisoners. So this is a major conflict. It's not really a civil war. Yeah.
You stated unequivocally that these were Russian troops.
This is believed to be. This was actually on Russian TV. They had pictures inside of this terminal with soldiers with the arm patch of the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade. And there was also some other, and I can talk about some of the evidence. I mean, there's a lot of competing claims, and I'm trying to give what I think is the best interpretation. There was actually a number of tweets. There was a Twitter account for families of the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade, and they were talking about, are men safe, and back and forth during this time. So again, there's always a grain of salt in some of this, but it appears to be, unless there were a whole bunch of guys with surplus uniforms from the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade. It's a very distinctive patch with it has an anchor on it. It's pretty clear. We know that the most Western governments, including as well as the Ukrainian government, believe there's somewhere around 10,000 Russian troops currently in Ukraine, bringing not only troops, but they're also bringing in heavy weapons to give to the people that they're backing. So this is a major conflict. This isn't a civil war, and I'll talk about why it's not really a civil war in a little bit. Why is it happening? What are the causes? What are the root causes of it? Where is it going? How does it affect us? Those are the things that I really want to talk about tonight. And so there was just kind of an overview. And I won't do a lot of these things with writing on them. So where does it start? Before we start, we have to do a kind of a mental shift, because the world we're going to talk about is not one that I think is familiar to us as Americans. We sort of have a way of seeing the world and assuming that this is the way things work. In our country, we may disagree with the government, we may dislike the government, we may not like what the certain policies are, but we have the general idea that our government is meant to serve us. Okay, the government is our servant. So we need to throw that out the window, first of all. Okay, so this alternate world we're talking about. In the alternate world we're talking about, the people exist to serve the government. Okay, so it's the reverse of what we think it is. Also, everything is a zero-sum game. Now, if I have a problem with you, maybe we can sit down and talk about it. We have this saying in America: it's a win-win situation. We can both get some advantage. We can sit down, we can talk about it, maybe come to some agreement that'll be okay for both of us. In this alternate world we're talking about, everything is a zero-sum game. I win, you lose. Okay. If I'm going to negotiate with you, the only reason I have to negotiate with you is if I am weak and I can't get what I want right away. Then I'll negotiate with you so I can get myself some breathing room. And power relationships are not transparent. So we have, and people used to do this in the old Soviet Union. They look at the Soviet Constitution. They say, well, it guarantees freedom of religion. So clearly they must have freedom of religion. The structure of the government, the Constitution, those things may or may not matter in this alternate world we're going to talk about. The power relationships are not transparent. What really matters is power. Who has it and who distributes it. And how that's distributed is not obvious. Okay, so we have people. We talk about people sitting down in smoke-filled rooms, cutting deals to get stuff through the Congress. Okay, everything there is a smoke-filled room, and you don't even know where the smoke-filled room is, and you don't even know that there is a room or what the smoke is. Okay, so it's completely not transparent. Law and government structures are not that important. Law exists. There's lots of laws, lots of government structures, but they may or may not matter. Okay, and it's how much power you have depends on how much the law is enforced for you. The law could be enforced sometimes and not other times. It just kind of depends. It's very useful in this alternate world, and particularly in any totalitarian society, to have lots of laws that are very hard to understand or hard to interpret, because anyone can potentially be arrested, anyone can potentially be a lawbreaker. It's very useful to be able to arrest anybody you want. Okay. So that we have to take the sort of world we know and kind of put that aside for a moment to kind of understand where this is going. I have a few photographs of this guy, Vladimir Putin, who's the leader of Russia, he hobnobs with lots of people, including Hollywood stars, and this is his possible girlfriend / wife. As a former gymnast, and also an official in the Russian government now. But this story really began, I would say, maybe as early as the 1970s. The roots of this go back. And in the 1970s, remember that we had still had the Cold War, we still had the Soviet Union going, and during that time, the Soviet Union began to sell oil and grain in the international market abroad. And they did this to get hard currency because their own economy was failing. Now they took that hard currency and they put it in foreign bank accounts, often in places like Switzerland that had a relatively secure banking laws or banking laws that people couldn't see what was in the banks. And this accounts began to build up. Now these foreign accounts, were overseen by the Communist Party. Rather than the Communist Party was separate from the Russian government, I can explain that later, but it was overseen by the Communist Party, but they were managed by the KGB. Now the KGB, which is Soviet Secret Services, managed a lot of the foreign accounts and a lot of the foreign business that went on in the Soviet Union. If you know anyone who did business with the Soviet Union prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were almost certainly dealing with people who were KGB. Now the reason for that is the KGB understood the world outside of Russia much better than anyone inside of Russia did. Okay, they understood things like, a lot of people didn't even know what a credit card was. They understood that. They operated in the West, and they understood how the system worked. So if they were going to have someone manage the accounts, it was going to be the KGB. Now, as the Soviet Union began to fall apart, and there's two theories about sort of what happened, and there's a standard theory that if you read it in many of the textbooks or you see it sometimes on the news, is that Russia attempted to create a democracy after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that failed. And in its place, Putin took control. There's a different theory, and it's beginning to now come to light. There's a couple new books about it. There's one that the library has, Karen DeWish's book. It's called Putins Kleptocracy. That detail a lot of this behind the scenes stuff. And this new theory is that there was never really a democracy established. There were some people who tried to do some things that were democratic, but for the most part there was a gradual takeover by the KGB. Now the way this appears to have happened, and remember these foreign bank accounts, is that as the Soviet Union began to fall apart, the Communist Party collapsed. And actually there was a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, which really marked the end of the Soviet Union. And after that, led by Communist Party hardliners, after that, the Communist Party was officially dissolved. Now, up to that point, the Communist Party had a lot of assets, billions of dollars in assets in Russia. They owned property, they owned all kinds of things. And what happened is that a number of individuals in the Communist Party, in cahoots with these KGB individuals who were managing those foreign bank accounts, began to ship that money out of the country. Now, this was probably the greatest act of theft that has ever occurred in human history. Billions and billions and billions, tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars disappeared overnight. In addition to that, for example, the Russian state gold reserve lost three quarters of its gold. 500 tons, more than 500 tons of gold disappeared. And if you're thinking, what is 500 tons? You could pretty much fill this room with gold bars up to about up to here. The floor couldn't take it. The floor would actually collapse if we put that much gold in here. But if you want to sort of visualize what 500 tons of gold is, it would be somewhat like that. 150 tons of silver, tons of platinum, oil worth something perhaps as much as 50 billion disappeared within months. Now, we don't know how much money actually was lost during this period, or how much left Russia during this period into these bank accounts. But there were three individuals, kind of upper to mid-level officials in the Communist Party who were in charge of them. Now, if we could interview those three people, we'd get a better picture of this. Unfortunately, they're all dead. They all died within about a few months of each other in 1991. They all died from falling out of high-rise apartment building windows. This is, it's funny. It sounds like a joke, but these people are real. This stuff really happened. So you can take all of the James Bond villains that you remember, and this is nothing. They're peanuts compared to what happened. Now, what then happened? In addition to that, there was property, and of course, the Communist Party disappeared. So those bank accounts were still sitting there, and who was in charge of them? The KGB, or what became the former elements of the KGB. And this money was then brought back to Russia, and used to buy up all kinds of things at fire sale prices. Okay, businesses, property, houses, factories, all kinds of things. Stock in the oil companies. I mean, you name it, the sky was the limit. And they got it, like I said, for well below market prices. And it was all these insiders. They were interviewing one Russian, these people were we call them oligarchs now. There was interviewing one of these guys who's close to Putin. And this newspaper reporter, this guy's worth billions of dollars. You remember the guy who had the yacht out here a few years ago? Okay, he's one of them, okay? And he's connected to a number of people who died in unpleasant ways. So, it was right here. And you saw how much that was worth. He's worth, I think he was worth like $9 billion or something like that. Anyway, they asked this guy, could all of your the money that you have, all the wealth that you have, could that stand up to legal scrutiny? He laughed and said, yes, everything but the first million. It's the competitive advantage that they had at the ground level that allowed them to buy up pretty much everything that was anything. Okay. Now there was a period of chaos that went on following the fall of the Soviet Union, in which there were several different groups of these insiders who were kind of fighting it out with each other. There were former Communist Party officials, there were former KGB people, there was the Russian Mafia. Now the Russian Mafia had existed was controlled by elements of the Communist Party prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. It became independent after the fall of the Soviet Union. In the last several years, it's been brought back under the control of the Russian security services. So most of the Russian Mafia operations worldwide are being overseen by what's called the FSB, which is the successor to the KGB. So these groups of people, in a sense, gradually took control of Russia. And at the center of all of this was Vladimir Putin. Now he was one author has called him the man without a face. He was a KGB operative in Germany. He appears to have been in charge of some of these bank accounts. There's a lot of conflicting stories about what he was doing in Germany. He was clearly a KGB resident, which meant he was a sort of known officer. He came back and became deputy to the mayor of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd. And it seems like a sort of a minor position. You're sort of the assistant to the mayor of a city. But in fact, that allowed him to control, in his position, he controlled all the foreign contracts. He controlled all business anyone who wanted a business license had to come to him. And this allowed him to enrich himself and to enrich the people who were close to him. And so he is worth today, it's believed to be around 70 billion. Again, that's a ballpark figure. That is slightly less than Bill Gates. But again, his income is like nothing. I mean, he has virtually no income. So he has somehow 70 billion. When he took office, he had 26 residences or something like that. I mean, it's just beyond what you can even imagine. There's actually a theory. There's actually a theory that he's actually a kleptomaniac. And during the many of his state visits, things have there was actually a Super Bowl ring that the owner of the Patriots, oddly enough, had. Why was the owner of the Patriots meeting with Putin? I don't know. Anyway, but the owner handed it to him and he pocketed it and walked away with it. Later, he got a call. He started to kind of complain about this, and he got a call from the White House saying, "Well, can't you just tell him it's a gift?" And he's promised, I guess, to replace it. But there was, when he was staying in France at the presidential, there was a Monet painting that disappeared, cut out of its frame. I mean, it's this weird kind of stuff. But sometimes truth is weirder than fiction. But anyway, this group of people took control of Russia. And Putin's vision for Russia is to recreate, there's some debate over what he exactly wants to create. He would recreate the Soviet Union. He believes that the fall of the Soviet Union was a terrible mistake. And so to recreate the Soviet Union, possibly some version of the Russian Empire, or some kind of odd combination of the two. And what's happening in Ukraine is an outgrowth of all of this. But essentially what Putin needs, and there's even an argument that Russia doesn't really have a government, it's being run by an organization. And basically what Putin does is he distributes the assets that he has to his followers to keep them in line. One of the things he did do, though, when he came to power, was he clamped down on all the other oligarchs, all these other elites who were stealing stuff in different parts of Russia. He clamped down on them. So essentially, instead of having many mafias, we have sort of one, and that created order. There was less crime on the streets, and of course, he benefited from at that time high oil prices, which allowed him to fund many different things. Let's see. Okay. Now, in Ukraine and the other Soviet republics, a similar process began to take place, but without as many of the foreign bank accounts. Now, there are people in Ukraine that use bank accounts in Cyprus and other places to stash their money. There's a variety of bank havens around the world. Cyprus is one of the ones that has a lot of the a lot of Russian money, as well as Ukrainian money. When we used to run our program, and the amounts we would send to Ukraine were piddly, like $100,000, which is not even worth considering. But what would happen is that we would send it we would get the money, of course, from USAID. We would send it to our bank in New York. It would then be wired to the bank in Kiev. It would then take a detour to Cyprus for about a week. It would spend about a week in Cyprus and then come back to the bank. Now, during that time, I don't know what they were doing. They were loaning it out or whatever they were doing. But $100,000, like I said, to these guys is nothing. But that's how things tended to operate. In Ukraine and in many other of the former Soviet republics, with some exceptions with the Baltic states, they're a little bit different story. But local oligarchs also took power. Former Communist Party officials, people associated sometimes with the security services, took power. And there was a similar process by which they, and this was true of the countries outside the Soviet Union, of Poland, of Hungary, Czech Republic to some extent as well, where these people who were connected insiders basically were taking the stuff and giving it to their friends. And so these four individuals, probably some of the better known Ukrainian, what are called oligarchs of the last decade, and they were all very wealthy people. Now, not all oligarchs are created the same. I mean, there are differences between them. Not all of them are hell bent on killing their opponents. And there's there are different individuals, different goals, and some of them have quote evolved.
Are there any honest ones?
They all got the money dishonestly to some extent, I would say. But again, we're dealing with an imperfect world here, so we have to keep that in mind. So this was essentially Ukrainian politics prior to, and then the first decade after independence was what I would describe as oligarchs versus oligarchs. You had these different oligarchs competing for the political offices, organizing. They had political parties. They had elections. And just because you have elections doesn't necessarily mean it's democratic. But you had elections, and some of them were, by the standards of what had come before, this was a big change. But what's interesting in Ukraine is, unlike Russia, elements of a civil society began to emerge. And like Belarus or Kazakhstan or some of the other former Soviet republics, what was called a civil society, that is, people organizing themselves, local organizations, non-governmental organizations, churches in some cases, charities, all sorts of interest groups began to emerge. Now, why did this happen in Ukraine and not other places? Well, one of the reasons, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, Ukraine was in some ways closer to the West. There were, we ran programs to help encourage this, so that was one of the things that we actually tried to do. How much effect that had, I don't know. That was I thought, a fairly worthy use of U.S. government money compared to some USAID things that I've seen being done. But nevertheless, people were closer to the West. There was also a large Ukrainian diaspora living in Europe and in North America, Canada, and the United States as well. And those people began to go back to Ukraine. They began to participate in some cases, in fact, the person who designed the Ukrainian money, the hryvnia, the first bills, was an artist from Canada.
And there wasn't a Russian diaspora of similar?
Not nearly as many, no. Not nearly as well established. They were much more recent, and a lot of them were actually Jewish. A lot of the people who left Russia were Jewish, and they didn't have as much of a connection to Russia. Some of them did, some of them didn't. That's a sort of another. But essentially, but also in Russia, the government was much more intent on clamping down on these elements of civil society. There was clampdowns in Ukraine, but it was less effective. And Ukraine was also close to part of Ukraine had actually been outside of the Soviet Union prior to World War II. And there was this Western Ukraine had this sort of strong nationalist tradition. So there was a strong national tradition that was opposed to Russia as well and opposed to that. So that began to develop. And in the early 2000s, in 2004, following without going into a lot of the details, there was a disputed presidential election that led to what was called the Orange Revolution. And the election was between Viktor Yushchenko, who you see on the top, and Viktor Yanukovych, who you see on the top right-hand side. And Yanukovych represented, for many people in Ukraine, the old way of doing things. His power base was in eastern Ukraine, which was an area of heavy industry, but also had the closest connections to Russia, and was seen as the candidate backed by Russia, whereas Yushchenko, even though he was also an oligarch, was seen as a more sort of national figure. Yushchenko, as you can see from his face, there was an attempted poisoning of him. He almost died. He was flown out to Vienna, where he was saved by doctors. And if you can Google before and after pictures of him if you want. But it appeared that, by the way, when it appeared that Yanukovych had stolen the election, spontaneous demonstrations began to break out in Kiev and elsewhere. This was known as the Orange Revolution, and it resulted in Yanukovych essentially a sort of a rerun of a sort of a fairer presidential election, which Yanukovych lost and Yushchenko won. Yushchenko was supported by Yulia Tymoshenko, who was another oligarch. Again, all these people had some past connection to the Communist Party. But Yushchenko came in sort of promising reform. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons. Some of it, there was an intense conflict that broke out between Tymoshenko and Yushchenko. It kind of fell apart. And so eventually, the opposition, the former opposition which had taken power, fell apart, and Yanukovych then won the presidency. And this began a period in which Ukraine began to drift back more toward Russia. Between about 2010 and 2013, there was a dispute among Ukrainian leadership in particular, as well as among Ukrainians, over which direction Ukraine was going to go. Is it going to go more toward the west? Is it going to have an agreement with the EU? Or is it going to have this closer tie to Russia? And Russia, of course, controlled a lot of the economy. The oil, the gas are coming in. And when Yanukovych in late 2013 decided not to seek an association agreement with the European Union, a new set of demonstrations broke out. This was known as Euromaidan, and this was in the center part of Kiev, and it became a sort of mass national movement between about November of 2013 and February of 2014. And this, Yanukovych attempted to repress this. There was a number of groups that he brought in. There was a security force called the Berkut, but also a group of sort of loosely organized thugs called Tatushki, who attacked demonstrators. The demonstrators fought back. A number of people were killed. Between 80 and 100 people were killed in the demonstrations. The result was basically these demonstrators began to take over government buildings. Security forces essentially fled. There was outrage against Yanukovych. He fled to Russia. And a new president was elected, Peter Poroshenko. Now this was the spark that led to these crises that began to engulf Ukraine. The Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership was not going to sit by. Ukraine is much too important to them. They want Ukraine, and they will do whatever they want, whatever they can to retain control of Ukraine. Now, what that looks like, we're not entirely sure. And so this began first again.
Why is the Ukraine so important to Russia?
First of all, industry, also position, but they also see it. They have a particular view. They do not believe that Ukrainians even exist. They believe Ukrainians are Russians who have essentially lost their way. Okay, they do not believe that Ukraine has a right to exist at all. They believe this is, and in fact. Lenin once said, "Russia without Ukraine is like a man without its head." So this is an attitude. It's not just the economic. It's not just the strategic side of it. There's a cultural side to this. There's a psychological side to this. If Putin is going to put together the Soviet Union or something like the Soviet Union. He cannot do it without Ukraine. Kazakhstan, Belarus, not as important. He wants those. He may want those back as well. People objecting to the change of government that happened when Poroshenko was elected president, quote, spontaneously rose up to take to basically detach Crimea from from Ukraine. This was aided by what are called little green men. This term is used. These are people who appear to be they're soldiers of some kind brought in from Russia, who are individuals who probably members of the security services of the military who were assisting these supposedly pro-independence folks in Crimea.
Have any thoughts concerning the nature of the objections of the people in Crimea, or supposedly the front groups in Crimea?
Well, they said the Ukrainian government was illegitimate, that they were fascists, that it was an illegal seizure of power. Now, interestingly enough, Yanukovych, who's gone to Russia, supposedly the real president, has kind of disappeared from the scene. He's essentially now irrelevant to what Putin has in mind. I'll talk about some of these other groups. I'll talk about some of the supposed separatist groups in the East as well. But essentially, this is a picture of the Euromaidan demonstrations at their height. These were, again, massive demonstrations that went on day after day throughout, up to, this was going on a year ago at this time, and until the Yanukovych fled. And this brought in a wide range of groups, from the right to the left. Now, there were groups in the far, and I'll talk about some of the composition of this in a second. There were ethnic minorities as well. The Tatar population largely supported this. In fact, the Tatar population was living, a lot of them were living in Crimea, and they objected to the seizure of Crimea by Russia. And there were support from the Jewish community, the small Jewish community in Kiev. This was a very broad-based movement. Now, it didn't have its main goal was to reform politics. They didn't have a clear, set of plans. It didn't have a laundry list of things it wanted necessarily to do. So it wasn't that focused, but they definitely knew they wanted a different kind of Ukraine than what existed before. And again, this is this manifestation of civil society that in Russia, there have been demonstrations against Putin, for example, or in Belarus. Those have been largely suppressed, and they didn't have the widespread support, from all elements of society that the Euromaidan or the Orange Revolution earlier had as well. Now, there's a lot of discussion now. So what's going on now? And this is a map of the different languages. And one of the things you often hear in the media is that, well, you've got the Russian speakers in the East, and they want to join Russia, and you've got the Ukrainian speakers in the West and in the middle, and they want to be independent. So, we could just maybe partition the country, and that'll be that. But it's a lot more complicated than that. It's really not necessarily about language, or even necessarily about ethnicity. Now, as you can see, there were more Russian speakers in the eastern part of Ukraine. There were more ethnic Russians they came in as government officials, through industry. Many of them had been coming since the 19th century. And so this looks like it's fairly clear. These two areas that you see on the east that are in the dark blue, these are actually the areas where the separatist fighting is occurring right now. Okay, and you see Crimea, that's already been detached from Ukraine and has officially, well, at least according to them, joined Russia. They had a referendum of union with Russia, and so they're back, supposedly back as part of Russia. And so it looks like, well, yes, you've got those areas that are separatist areas, and so that it must be about ethnicity, it must be about language. And I won't make your eyes blur over with this, but there's a significant number of Ukrainians, by the way, who speak Russian as their native language. Most Russians speak Russian as their native language, but there's lots of people who speak Russian as there's a variety of different ethnic groups. And hopefully this will, if you're interested in the figures, I can come back to them later and talk about them. This is from the 2001 census in Ukraine. This is the most recent one. However, the situation is a little more complicated than that. As you can see by this, and this is a map of the 2012 parliamentary elections. If you look at those areas in the east, you see that they're half or more ethnic Ukrainian. They're not necessarily majority ethnic Russian. There's a lot. Again, I said there's a lot of Ukrainians who speak Russian as their first language. So just because you speak Russian, just because you are Russian, doesn't necessarily mean. And of course, Kiev has a number of people. So the area that you see in the tan is what's called the Party of Regions, and that's the party that, at least prior to Euromaidan, was associated with the people who wanted to be closer to Russia. And we're supporting Yanukovych. But when you start to look at this, it doesn't quite match up. You have some areas in the west that are also supporting Party of Regions. You had areas that had supporting Party of Regions that were not necessarily entirely Russian-speaking in the south, and so the picture's a little more mixed than that. The Party of Regions did not necessarily represent people who wanted necessarily to be part of Russia. They didn't like what was going on maybe in Kiev. They opposed, for economic or personal reasons, opposed some of the other parties. The Fatherland Party and the Freedom Party were the other, Svoboda were the other two. That were competing, or were major parties in this election. And so just because you're a Russian speaker or that you are Russian doesn't necessarily mean that you are wanting to go back with Russia. And by the same token, just because you're a Ukrainian speaker doesn't necessarily, or you're Ukrainian, doesn't necessarily mean that you want to stay with Ukraine. Okay, so it's a lot more, the fault lines of this go a lot deeper than what sort of maps might show. And then very often you see some of the reports in the newspapers and the websites will say, well, that those people are all Russians, so what's the big deal about them going back to Russia? That was, of course, the argument about Czechoslovakia in World War II as well, but I don't want to point that out. But anyway, and then I'll show this is one of the reasons why this area is important. This is an area of heavy industry and also has large coal reserves. A lot of the some of the Kiev is the capital. It has a lot of economic activity, but these are areas that have a significant economic base. Other parts of Ukraine have less industry. This has a lot of Ukraine's productive, some of the more productive industries. So it's an important region. Now, one of the things that happened, and as this conflict began, as these what essentially happened after Crimea broke away, is that a similar thing began to happen in two provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk. These two easternmost provinces, and groups suddenly spontaneously emerged, claiming that they did not recognize the government in Kiev and wanting some form of autonomy or even full-fledged independence and to be closer to Russia. And this began to arm themselves. They began to appear with a large amount of weaponry. And it almost certainly came across the Russian border. This was actually monitored. They had convoys of arms, tanks, and armored personnel carriers coming across the border, along with individuals, including Russian troops. And pretty much everyone now, NATO, the US, European Union, acknowledges that there are Russian troops in. There's a dispute about how many there are. We're not entirely sure. It acknowledges that there are Russian troops in these areas. How many, we don't know. What they're doing, are they advisors? The Ukrainian government sent in troops to kind of take back control of these areas, and this is what the fighting has then essentially broke out. The Ukrainian government launched a significant offensive. They actually recaptured a large part of these areas, but then the separatist groups launched a counterattack supported by large quantities of Russian arms. And we're able to win back a lot of this territory. And I'll show you what is more or less a current map. So you have two new countries, one is called the Donetsk People's Republic, the other the Luhansk People's Republic. They haven't officially joined Russia yet, unlike Kiev. I mean, this is a little more complicated. The the leadership of these two new countries, the power seems to be located. There's a couple individuals who are members, who appear to have come from Russia. They're a little bit shadowy, but they are members of the former members of the security services in Russia. And they're the ones who hold power. Now, the rest of the governments are made up of some rather strange people. One of the leaders, one of the top leaders in the Donetsk People's Republic is a former rent-a-Santa. He was a mall Santa before all this happened. Actually, I'm going to get out of here for a second. Let's just open up this. I just wanted to. We're going to take a look here. This is interesting. I should have had this up before. So, as I say, these have governments. Stop this. Silly people. These have governments, and they have even ministers of culture. And the Luhansk People's Republic has a minister of culture. So here's the minister of culture. Now you're wondering, his name is Irina Filatova. You're wondering, what does she look like, this minister of culture? There she is. This is, you can do this at home. I like the one with her on the park bench in the bikini with the bottle of champagne in her hand. The Russian military, so there you go.
Is that business or for pleasure?
The pictures of her standing by the roadside, I mean, if you've traveled around Eastern Europe, there's a lot of prostitution on the roadside.
So are these governments puppets of Russia?
Yes, they are puppets. They are puppets of Russia. The Russian military that is actually supporting these groups has publicly, members of the Russian military have publicly stated about these people they're supporting. They've used the term scum. Okay, this scum, and that's the term used by Russian military officials to describe these people that they're assisting. Okay, and you have to remember that the Soviet Union created a vast sort of human tragedy in many ways throughout much. I mean, there was a lot of social, cultural, moral, family breakup, decline, alcoholism. I mean, there's a lot of sort of wreckage of that's left over. And these are the people that seem to be sort of, at least officially, at least the fronts of these two, seem to be just drawn from the dregs of society. I mean, quite literally. And the Russians appear to be quite open about that. These people are. And in addition to that, the Russians have also sent in, by the way, Chechens. They have a group of Chechens from, and there was this long civil war in Chechnya, which is part of southern Russia. And they created their own militia, which is incredibly thuggish. I mean, these people are, pure out and out killers. And there have been reports in the Chechnya was a largely Muslim area. There have actually been reports of some of the rebel forces yelling "Allah Akbar" as they're attacking in some of these. Now, whether that's confirmed or not, I don't know. The pro-Russian leader of Chechnya has actually asked his men to go to. He's then turned around and denied that they were there, but he actually asked people to go and fight in Ukraine. So there's a variety of different groups, all drawn in by the security services, this is kind of on this sort of ongoing struggle that has occurred. Now, this is the latest. From what I can gather, and I'll show you some sources. I have some web sources and other things of what's going on. The area that you see in pink is largely the area held by the Russian-backed forces, and the airport is right here by Donetsk. It's the sort of second arrow up from the bottom. There's continuing fighting. There was a report that I saw just the other day that battalion-sized units were. There's a village right outside the airport that kind of controls access to the airport. They have battalion-sized units repeatedly attacking, were driven back with heavy losses by Ukrainian troops. The kind of critical area here in the south is Mariupol, which is a port city. It's one of the major ports of Ukraine. It has a lot of economic activity goes through that. and there seems to be a push toward that. Also, there's a possibility that Russians are attempting to, or pro-Russian forces are attempting to push through and create a land corridor toward Crimea. The Voltseve in the middle, that sort of salient in the middle, and they're also pushing up along the border to sort of gain more border crossings. And so, again, this is a very fluid situation. There's been attacks on civilians. There was an attack, there was a shelling in Mariupol just the other day. A number of civilians were killed. There's also a possibility that there may be sort of guerrilla actions occurring in other parts of Ukraine, sabotage, things like that. That hasn't been yet confirmed. So it's a very fluid situation. It's a very, very violent situation. So what are the prospects and the plans? And I'll talk a little bit. Actually, I'll go back and I'll talk a little bit about, before I bore you with this, about what the American and U.S. response has been. Now, up until quite recently, the American policy primarily toward Russia, but the American policy toward Ukraine has been dependent upon our relationship with Russia, and we've wanted to have good relationships with Russia. It's quite understandable, but we've tended to turn a sort of very blind eye to what has been happening in Russia over the past, since 1990. We've wanted to believe that democracy is breaking out, and we've sort of looked the other way, I suppose, and Europe is the same way. Now, part of this goes back to the fact that a lot of the analysis that the U.S. government gets, and we see this in the media as well, comes from groups of people, analysts. In fact, the CIA is notorious for this. In the mid '80s, the CIA was claiming the Soviet economy was going great and growing and thriving, and it collapsed a couple years later. So people are front line against the foreign war on terror. Yes. Anyway, but the part of it is that the people who are doing the analysis are being trained in American universities in particular, are in a sense they have to be they want to be very they want to be tread very carefully when they talk about Russia, particularly under Putin. And imagine for a moment you're a young student and you're going to study Russia. You want to go to a Russian archive. You want to interview people in Russia. You want to get a visa to go to Russia. And you want those archives to be open to you. Well, if you write something critical of the Russian government, you might not get in. Okay. So there's a strong pressure to not say too much. That's the same thing actually happens with China as well. It's the same problem we have with many of our China experts. And so over time, people people talk about censorship, but the biggest censor is right up here in your head. It's the sensor. It's a sensor that you carry around with you. Should I write that? And, if you have a career, you've got a family to support. Well, you're going to jeopardize that by writing an op-ed piece about Putin not being much of a Democrat. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? It really takes a little bit of moxie to do that. In addition to that, there are many people who still see Russia as the successor to many people during the Soviet period, even though they didn't necessarily like everything the Soviets did. They kind of see that as the sort of as the progressive hope. Many throughout the 20th century, many intellectuals continue to see communism as this panacea. The guy who this publication here, The Nation, we have some copies. Stephen Cohen is like prime example of that. Cohen is actually the husband of the woman who edits The Nation. He was a professor at a number of important universities. He used to appear on American TV all the time. He's openly said that Ukraine doesn't deserve to be independent. He said this back in 1991. He's continued to say this, and he's even he's been actually the New Republic has lambasted him. The New Yorker's lambasted him as being an apologist for Putin. So, but he sort of continues to say this, and he appears on CNN and Fox periodically to kind of to repeat this kind of thing. And the Ukrainian government, a bunch of fascists, and et cetera, et cetera. We have this sort of problem with analysis, and the policy, I would say, since 2008 up until quite recently, to characterize. I mean, we started out with Secretary Clinton going to Russia with the reset button, which actually didn't say reset; it said overdrive. They mistranslated it to begin with. It hasn't gone well. Let's just say, and I think failure would probably be an apt term. That having been said, the Bush administration before that, I would probably say, this Bush was the guy who looked into Putin's soul, and so I don't know what he saw. But anyway, some kind of silly comment like that was also largely a failure. In fact, I would say the one Secretary of State that managed to get things right in the past 20 years, maybe Madeleine Albright, who had a sort of clear, having come from the Czech Republic, had a little bit clearer sort of vision of what needed to be done. But essentially, there's also kind of a great power mentality that we're a great power, Russia's a great power, so we're going to negotiate, and then we'll resolve all of our issues. These other little smaller countries, well, they can kind of tail along. So there was that attitude, and we wanted to believe things were going well in Russia. We didn't want to believe that it was going south, even when the evidence was kind of overwhelming. And so our policy has been, the policy of the Europeans has been equally lackluster. In fact, more so in some cases. They're more dependent on Russia for their energy supplies, in particular. There hasn't been any kind of strong response. And in the case of someone like Putin, this is going to be this. He's looking. He's waiting to see some pushback. If you're giving me all your stuff, I'm just going to keep taking your stuff until you say no. And Putin sees this, and this is what is being discussed internally. It's the internal line that the Russian government is putting out. It's in the Russian media. Is that this isn't a struggle about Ukraine? This is a struggle between America and Russia. This is America versus NATO, and so this is a clash of civilizations, and he represents, in his mind, Russia represents in his mind, the good virtues of civilization. The West is decadent. The term gay propaganda keeps coming up in Russian media. That this is what the West is promoting gay propaganda everywhere, and so this is. In his vision, the U.S. is the main enemy. We don't see, necessarily Russia as our number one enemy. In fact, at the last presidential debate, there was that discussion between the two candidates about, whether Russia was and there was some kind of back and forth about that. But whether we see Russia as our major enemy or not, they, at least internally, see us as their major enemy. And they've been very aggressive, especially recently, been very aggressive in the Arctic. Testing American defenses, flyovers, same thing in the Baltic, with Sweden, with the Baltic states. How far can we push? How far can we push the West? So, but one of the things that happened, and one of the things that I would say the maybe positive spin-offs of the situation in Crimea is that the U.S. government started to take a different tack in about March of last year. And they began to put sanctions on individuals within the Russian government. Now, the reason this is important, previously they put sanctions on governments. You freeze government assets. But what the U.S. government has begun to, in fact, we know this, and if you read Darwish's book, she points out that the WikiLeaks showed, if you remember WikiLeaks, all these cables that were leaked, the U.S. government knew what Putin was all about a long time ago. We just didn't want to say it publicly. They knew about the massive thefts of property. They knew, they had reports about people coming to, they had carloads of people coming with large suitcases and security guards to Putin's office, handing him, huge things of cash. This was well known. But only recently, the U.S. government has not necessarily sanctioned the Russian government. They've sanctioned individuals, Putin and individuals close to Putin. And so this is something that's going to bite a lot more. And it appears to, and there are some signs that it is biting, because these are the people who essentially own the Russian government. Okay, it's not they essentially control all the assets of the Russian government. And so those are that's where the U.S. policy stands. The Europeans haven't quite decided what to do. They've condemned, both the U.S. and Europe have condemned this Russian involvement in Ukraine. They've offered some humanitarian aid. There's some aid coming from Poland as well, which is obviously has a much bigger stake in this. There's some trainers, some military advisors that have come. They're taking some of the wounded soldiers and treating them in hospitals in Poland. And there's been some sort of things like blankets and boots and things like that brought from the U.S. So what are the prospects? What are the plans? And there's an article, I have a few copies of it by my colleague, Professor Hodakevich. He did a talk for the U.S. Army just a few weeks ago in Germany about Russian strategy. And if you're interested in that, it's a good kind of in-depth piece. And so Russia's goals are to keep destabilizing Ukraine. They want regime change in Ukraine. And what that looks like, it's very fluid. So it doesn't matter necessarily what, it could be a total takeover. It could be something like Belarus, where this, kind of an allied, proxy government. It could be somewhere in between. They want to control the resources, valuable assets. Again, this is a kleptocracy. This is a rule by thieves. They need things to distribute to people. They possibly open a corridor to Crimea. And so it could be piece by piece. It could be a full-scale invasion. They've publicly said, hey, we could march into Kiev tomorrow if we wanted to.
Why don't they?
Because they probably don't have the truth. They're afraid of what might happen, the backlash. But if they're getting what they want with the current strategy, they're not going to change it. It's a sort of, well, let's test the waters. We'll see what's going to happen. These people aren't stupid. I mean, these are people who survived, infighting of all kinds to survive. They're going to continue the disinformation, the cyber war. And you can see examples of this every day. If you're interested, you can go to if you see an article online, New York Times, there was one in the New York Times about Ukraine. You go to the comments section, and you'll see all these strange comments, pro-Russian comments, saying things like, well, what if California left the U.S.? What do we think about that? Or claiming this is a conspiracy. And these are actually people, and they all have addresses in Canada or the U.S., by the way, at least according to what the comments. These are all people paid by the FSB, or most of them, not all, I said all of them. Most of them are people paid by the FSB, which is Russian security services, to actually go on and make, they're called trolls, go on and make these comments. Feeling. For Ukraine, the goal is to survive. If the Ukrainian government can survive, in a sense, that's a victory. And the continued military resistance, no matter what. I mean, there was a comment, I think, from some European diplomats said, well, war isn't going to solve this. Isn't going to solve the situation. Unfortunately, I have to disagree. I'd like to say that we can negotiate, but the situation on the ground is very important, and so it's going to require. I'm sorry to say this, Ukrainian troops to fight and die if they're going to maintain a real independence. Okay, and that's a hard thing to say, but I don't see. This is not something that you can, like I said, this is a zero-sum game. Okay, you can't say, well, Putin's going to settle for this. Is going to settle for this part of Ukraine. It's not. I don't see that. It's not in his makeup. They have to also continue, and this is another hard part, institute economic and political reforms. Because if it continues to be a government by oligarchs, largely run by oligarchs, then it's all for naught. You're trading one bad situation, or well, it could be a worse situation, but you have to continue to build the elements of civil society, but also avoid radicalization. In wartime, radicalization occurs. There are radical elements in Ukraine. that they want to, attack all Russians, and there's a growing, and it's a reaction, counter-reaction. Russians are counting on that, by the way. Creating, stimulating. In fact, some of them may be agent provocateurs who are going in and sort of provoking some of those things. That appears to have occurred during the Euromaidan demonstrations, where they infiltrated people into the crowd to fire at the police and then cause the, they have to keep the attention of the European Union and the U.S. Keep the world's attention. That's the key thing. Time is not actually on Russia's side. Oil prices are declining. Putin's not going to live forever. Russia has very, very serious structural problems economically. The population is declining. There's all kinds of social problems that are going on in Russia. The population has huge alcoholism problems, and lots of things that is not. The Russian military is very good special forces. Overall, the Russian military is not that strong. They haven't instituted reforms from the top down, and so of course they still have nuclear arms too, unfortunately. This is very important because if Ukraine, which way Ukraine goes is going to determine in many respects what happens to the rest of Europe. Putin's made moves against Estonia. He kidnapped an Estonian security officer from the Estonian side of the border, and I think he's still being held in Russia right now. Smaller places like Transnistria, which is a little odd Russian-controlled statelet next to Ukraine, it's already essentially under Russian control. That would essentially fall Moldova. He said, my armies could be in Warsaw. So this is not a small thing. And it, even though our attention tends to be focused on the Middle East, we get a lot of, that's sort of where a lot of our public attention. This is in some ways as important, if not more important, potentially, because there's these. We don't know yet if some of the terrorists in the Middle East have nuclear weapons. These people do, and they used to, during the Cold War, they had what was called the first strike option. That is that they reserved for themselves the option to have a first nuclear strike against the U.S. That was taken off the table in the 1980s and 1990s. They've stated that their new doctrine, which was just published several months ago, has stated that they are putting that back on the table. That they are having that option of a first nuclear strike against the U.S. Now, they're probably not going to do it, but nevertheless, again, he wants to keep the stuff that he's already got. He doesn't want it blown up in nuclear. But there's going to be a lot of threats. There's going to be a lot of bluster. He's talked about taking back Alaska. This kind of. This is sort of hot air, but you never know. This guy's. This is very. This could be a potentially dangerous situation. So I have some sources, and if you're interested, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. These are English, of course. Kiev Post, which is a pro Kiev newspaper. Of course, it's actually run by. Former editor of the St. Paul Pioneer Press, which is where I used to live, and so it's run by an American journalist. But they hold the Ukrainian government accountable. Window on Eurasia is actually quite interesting. It's run by a former State Department analyst. A lot of stuff from the Russian media, the Russian opposition media, and it's translated into English. A number of these sites, by the way, Window on Eurasia is a good example. I was looking at I went on there, tried to go on about 2 weeks ago, and it had disappeared. And it was basically, I know people who know Gobel, and he said it was a cyber attack. So these, have your antivirus, stuff updated for sure. I'm not kidding. In fact, one of the things that the FSB scrubbed a lot of, there were things that were put on the web by the Russian opposition media that were scrubbed from a lot of that's been scrubbed from the web. But there are things that are left, and some of the FSB has actually put anti-Putin articles onto some websites that look like opposition websites, but what they are is they have viruses in them that destroy your computer when you open them up. So these are mostly things in Russian. So unless you read Russian, unless you're looking at But so I mean, do be careful. An Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, they actually have a monitoring mission. They issue reports about 4 or 5 times a week from the front line in Ukraine. There's a number of books as well. I highly recommend all of those. I think most of those I think we have in our library. I'm not sure Man Without a Face we have. We have Intermarium, we have Putin's Kleptocracy, and we have Putin's Wars. So if you have questions, comments, you have some of you have personal reflections, that would be fine. I'd be happy to entertain those. Yeah.
First of all, a great lecture. Really appreciate it. Could you just kind of talk in general terms, Russia's point of view about the expansion of NATO against its former into its former satellites, and their point of view about that?
Is entirely negative. I mean, during Yeltsin's time, Russian leadership was too weak, and most people, Putin in particular, feel that Yeltsin dropped the ball and didn't oppose it strongly enough. No, it's very negative. They see that. I mean, we have to sort of step back for a moment and say, well, these are sovereign countries that have a right to determine which organizations they join and which they don't. Why should Russia have the say on whether they join this or that? That's my. I mean, but I'm a biased voice. I was very active in pushing. I was helping to lobby members of Congress in my home state of Minnesota to vote for NATO accession. So that was, that's my perspective. But essentially, there is this sort of great power mentality, this idea that we have our own backyard, and Americans, have that attitude sometimes as well. That we have our own backyard and we get to say what goes with these other countries. But those are sovereign countries. Ukraine's a sovereign country. Estonia is a sovereign country, and they should have the right to determine whether they join those organizations or not. That's my take on it.
So speaking about prospects, the prospect is, if this scenario that you put up in the last slide takes place, the Russians are going to win. There will be Russian hegemony in Ukraine, which there is at this moment. There is some my observation is that the West has no intent of preventing that.
Probably not.
There are things on Ukraine's side of the list of things that they have to do that the West could be very helpful in promoting. To me, the popular desire for independence and democracy in their country is what has to be magnified.
Yeah.
And I don't see how the weak Ukrainian government and weak Ukrainian military can accomplish that alone.
Well,
why is there no Western force?
That's a great question. And actually, one of the things I should mention, though, and I was going to go back to this slide, is that after I should have mentioned this. I was planning to mention this. I'm glad you brought this up, because one of the things that happened after Crimea was taken and after these incidents began to occur in eastern Ukraine is that the support for Party of Regions dropped. There were a lot of people in Party of Regions who were opposed to the new group that was taking over in Kiev. They were opposed to Euromaidan, but they didn't want to fall under Russian control. And so the people who had been, this group of people in the East who had been backing the pro-Russian candidate began to back off. And they said, well, wait a minute. This is, in fact, in these areas, they did a number. There was actually 3 polls that were done. They had a supposed referendum that was, the ballot box was probably stuffed in these areas that they, wanting independence from Kiev. 3 different polling organizations, including Pew, which is a pretty reputable international polling organization, went into these 2 oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, and did public opinion polls on whether people wanted to, join, whether you wanted to join Russia, whether you wanted greater autonomy, you wanted to stay as you were. Only between 18 and 27% wanted to get closer to Russia. So not the majority. So we're not talking about a huge number of people. this is why I say time is actually on Ukraine's side, because what this has done is it's forced people to choose: do you want to be with Russia or do you want to be with Ukraine? There were a lot of people who weren't happy about what was going on with Euromaidan, who, no, well, I'm not sure I want to be in Russia either, and they kind of fall in between. So actually, that portion, that the sort of pro Putin move has actually lost support. Now, whether the Ukrainian government take advantage of that is yet to be seen. Again, they have, as you mentioned, they have their own problems with corruption. They have their own problems with political and economic reform. And so this is one reason why, I think it's one reason, to go back to what Norbert was asking, why they realize that they may have overstepped their bounds. Because on one hand, I mean, they could actually take over, and they could march their armies in. But whether they could control it over the long term, that's another story. You saw the Euromaidan demonstrations. They don't want that in their territory. Yeah.
Yeah, actually two questions. Number one, what about his buddies that he's got paid off, the other rich guys there? And at what point in time are the sanctions going to take enough of a bite where they might put pressure on Putin themselves to step aside?
My suspicion is that he is well aware of that. He keeps very close tabs on them, and that if you're asking, well, would they overthrow him at some point? I mean, it's anything's possible. I mean, you can't predict the future, but I would say he's tightened his grip on them.
And then the next part of the question is, with time is on the Ukraine side, and with the oil prices as low as they are right now, and with the clock ticking, would you say that the odds of Russia actually just launching an outright invasion are increasing or decreasing?
Hard to say. I mean, there are some analysts that say it's increasing. Others that say not sure. Right now, this is a relatively low-cost operation for him. So,
his ultimate goal is to take.
Right. Well, he sees the West and Europe as weak, and that eventually, I mean, it's actually interesting. This assault on the Donetsk airport appears to have occurred right after the attacks in Paris. Not that they were coordinated. I'm not even suggesting that, but taking advantage of people's short attention span. The West is worried about these attacks in Paris, and so now's the time to push in. And so he's relying on people's short attention spans.
When you say Crimea was taken over by the Ukraine, in my knowledge, it was a peaceful referendum.
It was,
and I'm from the Crimea, and I'm Russian. I guess I was a Ukrainian citizen with Russian nationality. So this is kind of a little bit confusing because there is not even one bullet flew over people's head. And even after President Obama had the speech, there is in the CNN news was being said something like, well, this is disaster situation, and in Crimea Peninsula 5,000 people was killed, which is totally not true. And when you're referring to the websites, Ukrainian websites, I say there is a both country has a propaganda, because in my knowledge, like when you show the picture of the blue guns, whatever the prime minister,
Yeah.
I've seen so many pictures of the Maidan when they show narcomans, drug addicts, prostitutes being paid, and they actually interviewing people. So I can say there's both sides has a negative. The both government is really corrupted. And people just want to have peace. I consider myself Russian to the bone. So I'm an American citizen. I have friends here in the front row, Ukrainian. We don't want to fight.
Of course. I think the people want to fight. I mean, it was a question of how much. I didn't mean to suggest that Ukraine was taken over, Crimea was taken over by Ukraine. This was transferred. Well, first of all, it was transferred in '54 by Khrushchev, and then it had not been part of Ukraine before then. So its ties to Ukraine are not that old. Okay, so that's certainly one part. But clearly, there was a takeover. I mean, pretty much. Everyone who's the Europeans believe this, the Americans, most people who, a lot of the people in Crimea have reported this, that large numbers of people began to show up with weapons, and they were quite clearly Russian military. So, I mean, yes, I do recognize that there's propaganda coming from the other side, and corruption.
It was a peaceful referendum in Crimea, which all my family was in that referendum, and a lot of people supported. I can say probably 80% people want to stay with Russia.
Okay, I mean, there are certainly groups of people who do want to stay. I definitely, yeah.
Are there any polls in Crimea like the Peel one in eastern Ukraine?
There are polls in the Donbass and in western Ukraine, and a lot of the polls, the Polish government recently just pulled a number of ethnic polls out of the Donbass area.
I mean, one about Crimea though. Any polls in Crimea?
Not many. There's Tatars. There's distinct ethnic community.
No, I mean no polls.
Oh,
vote.
polls. Oh,
Polls. No. Different. Not your.
not those polls. Okay,
Yeah,
no.
No.
Yeah.
I was like,
polls.
what are you talking about?
No, the.
That's in reaction to her.
Right. Yeah, there are a number. Again, with public opinion polls, I would. Yeah, there was certainly there was a large. And to your point, there was a large number of folks who were retired Russian military. This is very, you've been, some of you have been to Crimea. It's a wonderful vacation spot. Who were retired military people who wanted to stay with Russia. So definitely there's definitely a group of people, and probably stronger in Ukraine. I would admit probably stronger in Ukraine than in Donbass. But whether or not it was the majority and whether that referendum was a fair referendum, I'll let the European observers, I'll let their opinion. They had some real questions about the referendum. So, but again, I wasn't there. I didn't see it. So, yeah.
I keep reading news reports about Ukrainian prisoners of war being paraded in vignettes, and these reports keep saying that the local population considers them traitors and murderers. Do you have an opinion on
those videos, you can see those. They're pretty graphic videos of prisoners of war getting beaten up. And in one case, they rip the patches off and they stuff it in the guy's mouth and force him to eat it. What does the population think? In wartime, it's very hard to tell. When there's bombing and shelling, if you've studied the history of World War II or any war that's ever happened, people don't act what we think is quote rationally, and so this is human behavior. And so, are people attacking? I mean, was it staged? Is it? I don't know. I only know you can see the video and look it for yourself. And those are the Radio Liberty Radio Free Europe site has a link to those videos. No, go ahead.
The KGB's looting of the Communist Party assets. That's a new theory on what happened in Russia.
It's one that's gained a lot more credence. A lot more and more evidence has accumulated to kind of support that. I would say.
Is there any sort of interaction with the disaster capitalism theory?
Well, I mean, one of the theories about Russia was that they got this bad advice, capitalism didn't work.
Like this generally Western economics. The economists came into Russia and
gave them bad advice and gave them bad advice and
tried out some social experiments. They couldn't
some
try out
experiments, yeah. I mean, the problem with that is those Western analysts didn't have that as much influence as people think. When you look at the amount of money that was being, I mean, not that they gave great advice. I mean, that may have harmed them as well. I mean, but when you look at the overwhelming, I mean, the amount of money that was taken and then brought back into Russia through those foreign bank accounts. I mean, and if you think about the 1990s, I mean, remember, credit in the U.S. was very easy to come by in the 1990s. And I often wonder if there's some kind of connection about that to our own economy. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but there was clearly huge amounts of money were going back and forth. And when the collapse occurred in the late 90s, I mean, huge amounts of wealth were destroyed or disappeared. And so, like I said, there's the amounts of money that we're talking about. I mean, we have, some huge numbers of billionaires that are connected to that regime. And yeah, I mean, there are billionaires in Ukraine as well. And some of them, again, they got their wealth the same way, but the scale in Russia is so much greater, I have to say. And, there is this widespread support, by the way, in Russia for Putin. I mean, this is not, and we can sort of analyze why that is. But clearly, I mean, a lot of people still see him as someone who brought Russia back from the brink and is going to bring Russia to greatness. But, yes, sir.
The attacks on prisoners happened at the site of the trolley bus that anybody ran.
I'm not sure. That's a good question.
That was what I was.
I saw that report, but I can't. I am not there. I cannot confirm that. And I try to be, I try to be careful about some of those until I've seen OSCE and others sort of weigh in on it. I am not, in a position to really say one way or the other. But definitely, I mean, people are being bombed and shelled, and if someone is walking, you see a bunch of people walking down the street who you think did that and blew up your house, you'd be angry at them. I mean, you can understand people reacting.
Another question: how much of the total population of Donetsk and Lugansk fled?
We don't know for sure. Some of them large numbers have fled. I mean, most of that's one of the reasons why some of these referendums it's hard to, because a lot of people fled before the referendum. Tens of thousands of people certainly, probably more. I mean, the people have been displaced within those oblasts as well, away from the fighting zones. And so some of them have gone to the west, some of them have gone to places like Kiev, others have gone east as well. So I don't have hard numbers on it, but it's a significant number of people. And that's going to become a problem as this goes on. There's going to be a refugee crisis as well.
The resolve of Ukraine or lack thereof notwithstanding, how strong is NATO? It kind of begs the question: where is NATO? And
it depends on what you mean by NATO, I guess. If we're talking about, maybe militarily, politically, part of this has to do with the resolve that people have to get involved and try to solve a situation, or insert themselves in the situation, which is the more NATO gets involved, the more U.S. gets involved, the more they're going to be, people both sides are going to say you're doing the wrong thing, you should be doing this instead of that. If they don't get involved, people are going to say you should get more involved because terrible things are happening. They get involved, and they're going to say, oh, you messed it up. So it's a thankless kind of thing. But the governments in Europe that make up NATO, as well as the U.S. and Canada, have a variety of different opinions. Some of them want to work through the EU. They prefer to work with the EU. The French are probably the sketchiest as far as this goes. The Germans have been actually fairly strong in criticizing criticizing Putin. Obviously, the NATO members in the east, Poland, Baltic states, are the most interested in seeing some kind of robust response. There have been some military exercises. There are going to be some U.S. observers, military observers, that are going to go to Ukraine, and as I say, some non-lethal aid is being sent. But I wish I knew the answer to how much resolve they have, because on one hand they could be fairly robust. They could provide a fair amount of assistance to Ukraine. Will they do that or not? I don't know.
Well, things are dynamic. Isn't the upshot of this that perhaps the focus on the potential remedy here, i.e. NATO, might be that the onus is placed on NATO to kind of define itself a little bit more clearly?
That's actually a great question, because NATO is in some ways in search of a mission.
Well, and this is like the mission to end all missions, defining NATO.
Yeah, and of course this is outside of the sphere of what NATO is set up to do, because NATO is meant to be defensive. Of course, then again they got involved in Afghanistan, they got involved in other places as well. So, as a peacekeeping force, if it came to a situation where they needed peacekeepers, the problem with NATO is that the Russians wouldn't see them as honest brokers. So the Russians would not, and quite understandably, they see NATO as the enemy. In fact, they claim NATO troops are really fighting NATO troops in Ukraine. They're not fighting Ukrainians.
In light of Russia's apparent or alleged credibility problem here, wouldn't a little bit more sober heads prevail through NATO?
You think so, but NATO is made up of a group of people, a group of countries that all have their own interests. Germany has very different interests in this than, say, Estonia. I mean, Germany gets a lot of its energy from Russia, and while they're shocked at what has happened, and Merkel is clearly shocked at what has happened personally. How far they want to go. How do you want to hurt your economy? I mean, she's got to stand for elections. The new party in Greece has some close connections to individuals close to Putin. They're saying no, we can't do that. I mean, it's got to be they all got to be in it, or they're not going to be in it.
Follow the money.
Yeah, I mean, there's a and it's like herding cats. I mean, Europe is not. I mean, people talk about the United States of Europe and all this, but it's not very united. And they all. I mean, Italy, Spain, they've got serious issues, economic issues. They're not gonna really want to be involved in this. Britain. Yeah, I mean, Britain is probably pretty strong there. If you're watching the news, there was an assassination that occurred in Britain. Former KGB officer who had, basically blown the whistle on Putin, Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned by this incredibly high dose of radiation, and they're doing the inquest right now, and they actually had the doctor saying that this was the most dangerous autopsy he'd ever undertaken because his body was so radioactive that it was just like, you couldn't touch it. And so people in England, and this has been clearly linked to the Russian government, the British government has openly stated that they have, the chief investigator has stated that he has seen evidence, convincing evidence that the Russian government is behind this. That has, and this because, and also it was a public health issue in England because they found traces of this radiation all over London. This was so radioactive. The stuff they used was so radioactive. They found signatures of it all over the place. So it was actually endangering the public as well. So there's a lot of bad feeling about that. So Sweden, not a NATO member, but definitely, feeling the heat as well. There was a submarine incident off Swedish waters recently where some kind of submarine surfaced in Swedish waters. Appears to be, they think it's Russian, they don't know for sure, but Swedish military went on high alert. So, I mean, it's a cat and mouse game. It's a cat and mouse game.
Okay, well, clarification, and then the second question. First clarification is that you're pretty sure that the economic turmoil of the 90s caused principally by the theft of these assets and the removal, then they're bringing them back in.
Mm-hmm. And some of them are still, the assets are moving. These are liquid assets. The moving assets.
It's a constant cycle.
Right. Yeah.
And then the second question is: any thoughts?
Yeah, he's asking about the transfer of assets that occurred in the early '90s, into foreign bank accounts and back into
I
Russia.
just had a Rice Krispie treat. Sorry.
Okay.
It's coming. The
groups in Europe that support. That have gained support from Putin, or have Putin has gained support from it. One is the far left, and the other is the far right. And so, in both of them, and essentially the critique that he's offered is that the West is decadent. For people on the right, he has stated that he's going to restore Christian civilization. He's defending Christian civilization against the oddly atheistic West, kind of a reversal of Cold War rhetoric, and for the left, he's against this sort of capitalist takeover that George Soros is behind, all the demonstrations in Ukraine, and so he's against both, and of course there's a sort of residual. Well, it's the old Soviet Union, so we still have to kind of support it on the left, but. So in a sense, both extremes, and Europe is becoming more polarized. So I think, there is that issue. The economic crisis in Europe is but again, not everyone on the right and not everyone on the left is supporting Putin either. You've got parties on the right in Britain who are definitely not supporting Putin. You've got parties on the left that abhor Putin. So. Each country is different, and But yeah, I mean, when there's a bank involved, you know.
And just the implications of, say, what if the National Front were to say win the coming elections 2 years hence and taking a pro-Russian policy? What would that do?
Well, I don't think it would change that much. I don't think. I mean, it would. I mean, Europe is already divided. This would simply further that trend. I mean, I don't think it would. It wouldn't be any I mean, it might be a cataclysm for France and create problems with it. But I think France has enough. Part of each of these countries has enough problems in it. So France has plenty of problems, as we've seen in the news lately, that it doesn't want to get involved. I mean, the impulse for most people is not get involved with this. Stay out. You know, it's someone else's business. The house over there is burning down. Let it burn. You know, my own house might be in danger from stuff that's going on in my house. I have enough to worry about. You know. Okay, well, thank you all. I appreciate it.